A woman who lives alone is not waiting to be saved. She is often recovering from everything that tried to break her. There is a profound misunderstanding in the modern world. People believe that being alone automatically means being unhappy. They see a woman living by herself, spending evenings in silence, walking through life without a partner beside her, and immediately assume there is something missing. Society has conditioned people to fear solitude as though it were a dark room where sadness waits patiently in the corner. But solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. Loneliness is the pain of feeling emotionally disconnected, even when surrounded by people. Solitude, on the other hand, can become one of the deepest forms of emotional freedom a human being can experience. Many women who choose to live alone are not escaping life. They are finally meeting themselves honestly for the first time. For years, some of them lived according to expectations that were never truly their own. They played roles assigned by family, relationships, culture, and social pressure. They became caretakers, emotional supporters, problem solvers, and silent sacrificers. Their value was measured by how much they gave, how much they tolerated, and how successfully they made others comfortable. Somewhere in the middle of all that noise, they lost the sound of their own inner voice. Solitude becomes the space where that forgotten voice slowly returns. A woman who learns to be alone begins to discover parts of herself that were buried beneath constant emotional obligations. She starts noticing what truly brings her peace when nobody is influencing her decisions. She learns what kind of music calms her spirit, what thoughts keep her awake at night, what dreams she abandoned to satisfy others, and what kind of life genuinely feels authentic to her. These discoveries cannot happen easily in environments filled with constant distraction and emotional dependency. Solitude creates a mirror that reflects the truth without interruption. There are people who stay in relationships not because they are deeply loved, but because they are terrified of facing themselves. They fear silence because silence exposes unresolved pain. They fear empty rooms because empty rooms leave no place to hide from their thoughts. Many women who live alone have already walked through that uncomfortable emotional territory. They have sat with grief without numbing it. They have faced disappointment without immediately searching for another person to erase it. They have learned how to survive difficult nights without depending on external validation to feel worthy. That process changes a person permanently. In solitude, a woman slowly stops performing. She no longer dresses, speaks, behaves, or even dreams according to what will gain approval. She begins existing without an audience. And that can be revolutionary in a world where women are constantly observed, judged, and evaluated. Living alone allows her to remove the invisible mask she wore for years. She no longer has to negotiate her peace every day. She can wake up without emotional tension in the air. She can sit quietly with a cup of coffee and realize that calmness itself is a form of happiness many people never experience. What makes solitude powerful is that it teaches emotional self-sufficiency. A woman who becomes comfortable alone develops an inner stability that cannot easily be shaken by rejection, abandonment, or temporary loneliness. She understands that her identity does not disappear simply because someone walks away from her life. She no longer confuses companionship with emotional security. She learns that peace is more valuable than constant attention and that silence can sometimes heal wounds that endless conversations never could. This is why solitude often intimidates people who do not understand it. They interpret independence as emotional coldness because they cannot imagine fulfillment without constant connection. But a woman who has learned to enjoy her own company is not rejecting love. She is rejecting the desperation that makes people accept relationships that slowly destroy them. She no longer seeks someone merely to fill empty space. She seeks depth, honesty, emotional safety, and genuine understanding because solitude has taught her the difference between connection and dependency. There are nights when solitude feels heavy, of course. There are moments when silence becomes difficult and human longing returns with enormous strength. But even in those moments, many women who live alone discover something important. Temporary loneliness is survivable, but living disconnected from yourself for years can destroy your spirit slowly and invisibly. There comes a moment in the life of many women when exhaustion reaches deeper than the body. It becomes emotional exhaustion, the kind that sleep cannot fix. It is the exhaustion of constantly managing tension, calming conflicts, tolerating disrespect, carrying emotional burdens, and sacrificing inner peace just to keep relationships alive. From the outside, people often assume that women who choose to live alone are rejecting companionship, but many of them are actually rejecting chaos. They are rejecting the emotional instability that slowly consumed their energy for years. After experiencing relationships filled with confusion, manipulation, inconsistency, or emotional neglect, peace becomes more attractive than romance itself. Some women spend years trying to save relationships that were quietly destroying them. They become experts at understanding everyone else's emotions while ignoring their own pain. They learn how to remain patient during disrespect, how to stay silent during disappointment, and how to forgive behavior that continuously wounds them. Little by little, they become emotionally drained without realizing how much of themselves they are losing. Many women are taught from an early age that preserving a relationship is more important than preserving their mental and emotional well-being. They are encouraged to endure rather than question whether the relationship is healthy at all. Eventually, something inside them changes. Sometimes it happens after betrayal, sometimes after years of feeling invisible, sometimes after realizing they no longer recognize the person they became while trying to maintain emotional harmony for someone else. They begin to understand that love should not constantly feel like survival. They realize that waking up anxious every day is not passion, and emotional instability is not proof of deep connection. What many people call love is often attachment mixed with fear, dependency, and unresolved wounds. A woman who chooses peace starts becoming selective with what enters her emotional world. She no longer welcomes chaos simply because she fears being alone. She no longer confuses intensity with intimacy. Loud emotions, dramatic reconciliations, endless arguments, emotional games, and unpredictable behavior stop feeling exciting and begin feeling exhausting. What once seemed romantic now feels emotionally unsafe. She starts valuing calm conversations, honesty, consistency, emotional maturity, and mutual respect because her nervous system has become tired of surviving emotional storms. This transformation often surprises people around her. Friends may say she has become distant. Others may assume she has become cold, difficult, or impossible to please. But the truth is usually much simpler. She has learned through painful experience how expensive chaos truly is. Emotional chaos steals concentration, sleep, confidence, health, and peace of mind. It occupies thoughts during the day and follows a person into the quiet hours of the night. A woman who has spent years trapped in emotional instability eventually reaches a point where peace becomes sacred to her. Living alone can become part of that healing process. In solitude, there are no sudden emotional explosions waiting behind closed doors. There is no need to walk carefully around another person's moods or unpredictability. There is no constant fear of disappointing someone, being misunderstood, or emotionally abandoned. For the first time in years, she can breathe without tension sitting heavily on her chest. She can organize her life according to stability instead of emotional survival. The silence in her home may appear empty to others, but to her it feels safe. Many women who choose peace over chaos are not anti-love. In fact, they often still believe deeply in love. But they no longer believe love should require self-destruction. They understand that genuine connection should bring clarity instead of confusion. Healthy love does not constantly create anxiety about where you stand. It does not force someone to beg for attention, affection, honesty, or basic emotional care. Real love creates emotional safety, not emotional warfare. One of the most powerful things a woman can learn is that she does not have to remain in environments that damage her spirit simply to avoid loneliness. The fear of being alone has trapped countless people inside unhealthy relationships. But once a woman experiences the peace that comes from emotional stability, she becomes less willing to trade that peace for temporary companionship. She begins protecting her inner world with greater wisdom. She understands that not every relationship deserves access to her energy, her vulnerability, or her time. There is also a deeper emotional maturity that develops when peace becomes a priority. A woman starts recognizing red flags earlier. She pays attention to patterns instead of empty promises. She values emotional accountability over charming words. She notices how people make her feel after conversations, after conflicts, and after difficult moments. She stops romanticizing suffering and begins understanding that emotional health matters just as much as emotional connection. People often admire independent women without understanding the difficult emotional journey that created their independence. They see confidence, strength, emotional control, and self-sufficiency, but they rarely see the invisible wounds underneath those qualities. Independence is not always something a woman originally desired. Sometimes it is something life forced her to develop after disappointment became too familiar. Many women did not become strong because the world treated them gently. They became strong because they discovered that relying completely on others often led to heartbreak, abandonment, betrayal, or emotional neglect. There are women who once trusted deeply, women who believed promises without hesitation, who loved with sincerity, who gave people countless chances because they genuinely believed in loyalty and emotional connection. But repeated pain changes the way a person moves through the world. A woman who has been emotionally abandoned enough times eventually begins learning how to survive without expecting rescue from anyone. This transformation is rarely dramatic in the beginning. It starts quietly. She stops asking for help as often. She becomes more careful with vulnerability. She learns to handle problems alone because experience has taught her that depending on others can sometimes create even greater pain. Pain has a strange way of forcing emotional evolution. A woman who repeatedly feels unsupported during her hardest moments slowly develops an inner voice that says, "I must learn to carry myself." At first, this realization feels heavy and unfair. There is grief in understanding that the people you once depended on emotionally may not truly be capable of protecting your heart, but over time, that painful awareness becomes strength. She begins building a life where her emotional stability no longer depends entirely on another person's presence, consistency, or approval. Many independent women were once extremely soft-hearted. They gave endlessly, trusted easily, and loved without defensive walls. But after enough emotional disappointment, they began realizing that kindness without boundaries can become self-destruction. They learned that constantly sacrificing themselves for others does not guarantee loyalty in return. Some discovered that the more they ignored their own needs, the more invisible they became in relationships. Others learned that certain people only appreciated their presence when they were useful, emotionally available, or endlessly forgiving. These painful experiences often create a profound emotional awakening. A woman begins understanding that independence is not about proving she needs nobody. It is about making sure she never completely loses herself inside another person again. She starts creating emotional boundaries because she remembers what happened when she had none. She becomes cautious with trust because she remembers the pain of being deceived. She values self-respect because she remembers the damage caused by tolerating mistreatment for too long. There is also a loneliness hidden inside independence that many people fail to notice. Strong women are often expected to carry everything silently because others assume they no longer need support. People admire their resilience while forgetting that resilience is often built through suffering. Behind many independent women are years of crying privately, healing quietly, and rebuilding themselves without emotional assistance. There were nights when they felt broken but still woke up the next morning and continued functioning because life gave them no alternative. Over time, pain teaches survival skills that eventually become part of a woman's identity. She learns how to manage finances alone, solve problems independently, comfort herself emotionally, and make difficult decisions without constant reassurance. What began as emotional necessity slowly transforms into confidence. She realizes she is capable of surviving circumstances she once believed would destroy her. That realization changes the way she sees herself permanently. But independence born from pain can also create emotional complexity. Some women become so accustomed to protecting themselves that vulnerability begins to feel dangerous. They struggle to trust even sincere people because past experiences taught them that emotional safety can disappear unexpectedly. They become hyper aware of inconsistency, manipulation, or emotional dishonesty because they have already suffered the consequences before. Their independence becomes both a shield and a survival mechanism. This is why many independent women appear emotionally reserved at first. It is not always because they are cold or uninterested in connection. Often, they simply understand the emotional cost of opening their hearts to the wrong people. They know how long it takes to rebuild peace after betrayal. They know how deeply emotional wounds can affect confidence, identity, and mental stability. Their caution is not arrogance, it is memory. Pain also changes what a woman values in life. Superficial attention begins to lose importance. Empty words stop impressing her. She becomes more interested in emotional consistency, honesty, reliability, and peace because she understands how rare those qualities truly are. Independence teaches her that she can survive without many things, but she no longer wants relationships that require constant emotional suffering just to continue existing. A woman who built herself through pain often carries a quiet strength that cannot easily be explained. She has already experienced emotional darkness and learned how to walk through it alone. She no longer panics when life becomes difficult because hardship already shaped her character. She understands that survival sometimes requires letting go of illusions, facing uncomfortable truths, and rebuilding life from emotional ruins with no guarantee that anyone will stay beside her during the process. Society has always been uncomfortable with women who cannot be easily defined by traditional expectations. A woman who lives alone challenges many deeply rooted ideas about femininity, relationships, and success. For generations, people were taught to believe that a woman's happiness must revolve around partnership, marriage, family roles, or emotional dependence on others. Because of this, when a woman chooses solitude or independence, many immediately begin searching for explanations. They assume something must have gone wrong in her life. Some think she is lonely, bitter, difficult, emotionally damaged, or incapable of maintaining love. Very few people stop to consider that she may simply be at peace. There is a silent pressure placed upon women from an early age. They are often taught that being chosen is one of the greatest validations of their worth. Movies, social traditions, and cultural expectations repeatedly reinforce the idea that fulfillment arrives through romantic attachment. A woman alone is frequently portrayed as incomplete, waiting, or emotionally lacking. Because of these messages, society struggles to understand women who are not desperately searching for validation through relationships. Independence in women is often viewed with suspicion rather than admiration. When a man lives alone, people usually describe him as independent, focused, ambitious, or self-sufficient. But when a woman lives alone, society often responds differently. Questions appear immediately. Why is she single? What happened to her? Does she not want a family? Is she too demanding? The assumption behind these questions is that solitude must be a problem needing explanation. Rarely do people consider that a woman may consciously choose a life centered around emotional peace, personal growth, freedom, or self discovery. Many women who live alone become exhausted from constantly defending their choices. They feel pressure from family members, social circles, co workers, and even strangers who project their own fears onto them. Some people assume a woman cannot possibly feel fulfilled without romantic attachment because they themselves fear solitude deeply. Others romanticize suffering in relationships so much that they see any woman who walks away from emotional chaos as selfish or unrealistic. Society often praises women for endurance rather than emotional wisdom. Women who tolerate unhealthy situations are called loyal, patient, and devoted, while women who prioritize their peace are sometimes labeled cold or selfish. There is also discomfort surrounding women who become emotionally self-sufficient. A woman who enjoys her own company becomes harder to manipulate through fear of abandonment. She no longer stays in unhealthy relationships simply because she fears being alone. She begins making decisions from self-respect rather than desperation. That level of emotional independence unsettles people who are accustomed to women sacrificing themselves endlessly to preserve relationships at any cost. Society also misunderstands the emotional complexity behind solitude. Many assume that a woman living alone must hate relationships or reject love entirely, but often the opposite is true. Some women choose solitude precisely because they value emotional connection deeply and no longer wish to settle for superficial or damaging relationships. They are not avoiding love. They are avoiding emotional environments that slowly destroy their mental peace. They understand that companionship without emotional safety can feel lonelier than physical solitude itself. There are women who spent years trying to meet every expectation placed upon them. They cared for others, compromised constantly, remained emotionally available, and ignored their own needs for the sake of harmony. Yet, despite all their sacrifices, they still found themselves emotionally drained, unseen, or unfulfilled. Eventually, some begin asking themselves difficult questions. What if my value does not depend on constantly giving myself away? What if peace matters more than appearances? What if being alone is healthier than living emotionally disconnected inside a relationship? These questions often lead women toward lives that society struggles to understand. Another reason society misjudges women who live alone is because solitude forces honesty. Without constant distractions, a person must face themselves completely. Many people avoid this at all costs. They remain in unhealthy relationships, surround themselves with noise, or chase endless validation because silence reveals unresolved fears and emotional wounds. Women who choose solitude are often doing the difficult emotional work that many others postpone indefinitely. They are confronting grief, identity, healing, disappointment, and self-discovery directly instead of masking pain through dependency. There is also an unfair contradiction in how society views strong women. People admire confidence and independence in theory, but in reality, they often become uncomfortable when women genuinely embody those qualities. An emotionally independent woman is less likely to tolerate disrespect, manipulation, inconsistency, or emotional immaturity. She asks deeper questions. She establishes boundaries. She values her time and peace. This challenges people who expect women to remain endlessly accommodating regardless of how they are treated. Many women who live alone are not trying to prove superiority over relationships or men. They are simply trying to build lives where their emotional well-being is no longer constantly sacrificed. They want calmness instead of emotional turbulence. They want honesty instead of performance. They want relationships built on mutual respect rather than dependency or fear. But because society has romanticized suffering for so long, Women who choose themselves are often misunderstood before they are understood at all. One of the most powerful transformations that can happen in a woman's life often begins in silence. When a woman starts living alone, away from constant emotional influence, expectations, and the noise of other people's opinions, she enters a space where her true identity slowly begins to reveal itself. For many women, this is not an easy process. In fact, it can feel deeply uncomfortable at first because so much of their identity was shaped around pleasing others, maintaining relationships, adapting to expectations, or fulfilling roles society assigned to them long before they truly understood themselves. Many women spend years becoming who others need them to be. They become supportive partners, reliable caretakers, emotional healers, peacekeepers, and providers of comfort for everyone around them. Over time, they become so focused on maintaining emotional harmony that they stop asking themselves important questions. What do I truly want? What kind of life actually fulfills me? Which parts of my personality are genuine? And which parts were created simply to gain acceptance, love, or approval? These questions often remain buried beneath daily responsibilities and emotional obligations. Solitude creates the quiet environment where those hidden questions finally rise to the surface. At first, being alone can feel unfamiliar because there is no audience left to perform for. A woman suddenly notices how much of her behavior was influenced by the expectations of others. Even small things begin to change. The way she decorates her home, spends her evenings, organizes her routines, chooses her clothes, or uses her free time slowly becomes an expression of her authentic preferences instead of social conditioning. These changes may appear simple from the outside, but emotionally they are profound because they represent the gradual return of individuality. A woman living alone begins noticing her inner world more clearly. She becomes aware of her emotional patterns, fears, insecurities, strengths, and desires without external distractions constantly interrupting her self-awareness. In relationships, especially unhealthy ones, people often become consumed by reacting to another person's moods, expectations, or emotional instability. Solitude removes much of that noise. It creates space for reflection, honesty, and emotional clarity. For the first time in years, a woman may realize what truly exhausts her, what genuinely brings her peace, and what parts of herself she abandoned in order to maintain connection with others. There is something deeply revealing about spending time alone consistently. Without constant validation from others, a woman must learn to build a relationship with herself. She learns whether she enjoys her own company or constantly seeks distraction to avoid her thoughts. She begins understanding her values beyond social approval. She notices which dreams still matter to her when nobody else is influencing her choices. This process can be emotionally intense because identity is often buried beneath years of adaptation. Some women discover they spent most of their lives seeking permission to exist fully, permission to speak honestly, to rest, to pursue passions, to set boundaries, to say no, to prioritize their needs, or simply to take up emotional space without guilt. Living alone can become the first environment where they finally experience personal freedom without constant negotiation. They no longer have to shrink themselves to maintain peace in relationships or suppress parts of their personality to remain acceptable to others. As solitude deepens self-awareness, many women also begin confronting painful truths about their past. They realize how often they accepted less than they deserved because they feared abandonment. They recognize how many times they ignored their intuition to preserve relationships. They see the emotional masks they wore to appear strong, agreeable, or endlessly understanding. This awareness can feel heartbreaking because it forces a woman to acknowledge how disconnected she may have become from her authentic self over the years. But this confrontation with truth is also healing. A woman starts rebuilding her identity intentionally rather than unconsciously. She learns to make decisions based on inner alignment instead of fear. She begins trusting her own judgment more deeply because solitude teaches her how to listen to herself without interference. Her confidence becomes quieter but more genuine because it no longer depends entirely on external praise or validation. Living alone also teaches a woman what kind of emotional environment allows her spirit to thrive. She begins recognizing the difference between peace and emotional numbness, between love and dependency, between genuine connection and attention. She develops a stronger sense of personal standards because she now understands herself more clearly. She knows what drains her energy, what inspires her growth, and what compromises feel emotionally destructive. There is a unique kind of strength that emerges when a woman becomes fully acquainted with herself. She no longer feels compelled to chase identities that impress others but leave her emotionally empty. She becomes more comfortable with authenticity even if it disappoints people who preferred the version of her that was easier to control or emotionally dependent. Her life starts reflecting her inner truth instead of society's expectations, and that transformation often changes the way she walks through the world entirely. One of the greatest illusions society teaches is that happiness begins when someone finally finds the right relationship. From an early age, people are surrounded by stories that present romantic love as the ultimate destination of human fulfillment. Movies, songs, social expectations, and cultural traditions constantly repeat the same message. Life becomes complete when another person enters it. Because of this, many women grow up believing that being loved by someone else is the highest proof of their value and the main source of lasting happiness. Yet countless women eventually discover a painful truth. A relationship can provide companionship, affection, and emotional support, but it cannot permanently fill the emptiness created by disconnection from oneself. Many women spend years chasing emotional fulfillment through relationships because they were never taught how to create happiness independently. They enter relationships believing love will heal insecurity, loneliness, confusion, or emotional wounds. At first, the excitement of connection creates temporary emotional relief. Attention feels validating, affection feels comforting. Being desired creates the illusion of completeness, but over time reality appears. Even loving relationships cannot protect a person from inner emptiness if that emptiness existed long before the relationship began. This realization can be shocking because society rarely prepares people for it. There are women who had relationships exactly as they imagined them, yet still felt emotionally unfulfilled. They were not lacking companionship, but something deeper remained unsettled inside them. Some ignored personal dreams for years while focusing entirely on maintaining relationships. Others sacrificed their individuality in exchange for emotional security. Many became so consumed by caring for another person that they lost connection with their own identity, passions, and emotional needs. Eventually, they discovered that happiness built entirely around another human being is fragile because human relationships are unpredictable and constantly changing. A woman who learns to live alone often begins understanding happiness in a completely different way. She realizes that peace can exist without constant romantic involvement. She discovers moments of contentment in ordinary experiences that have nothing to do with validation from others. A quiet morning alone, emotional stability, freedom from conflict, personal growth, meaningful work, creativity, physical health, spiritual clarity, and inner calm begin carrying more emotional weight than temporary excitement or external approval. Happiness becomes less dependent on being chosen by someone and more connected to the quality of her relationship with herself. This shift is deeply transformative because it removes enormous emotional pressure from relationships. When a woman no longer expects another person to complete her emotionally, she begins approaching love from a healthier place. She stops treating relationships as emotional rescue missions. She no longer believes she must tolerate disrespect simply to avoid loneliness. She understands that companionship should enhance life, not become the sole foundation supporting her emotional stability. Many women who discover happiness outside relationships also become less vulnerable to emotional manipulation. People who fear loneliness intensely are often willing to accept unhealthy dynamics simply to avoid being alone. They stay in emotionally exhausting relationships because they believe losing the relationship would mean losing happiness itself. But a woman who has already learned how to build a meaningful life independently becomes harder to control through fear. She knows she can survive emotionally on her own. She knows her identity remains intact even without constant romantic validation. Living alone also gives women the opportunity to rediscover neglected parts of themselves. Many begin pursuing passions they abandoned years earlier. They reconnect with creativity, curiosity, learning, spirituality, physical health, friendships, and personal ambitions that had been overshadowed by relationship-centered living. Happiness gradually becomes more multidimensional. Instead of depending entirely on one person for emotional fulfillment, they build lives rich with experiences, purpose, self-respect, and inner peace. This does not mean women who live alone never desire love. Most still value emotional intimacy deeply. They still long for understanding, affection, companionship, and meaningful connection because these desires are profoundly human. But the difference is that they no longer view relationships as the sole source of joy or personal worth. Love becomes something beautiful to share rather than something desperately needed to feel complete. There is also a profound emotional freedom that emerges when happiness is no longer tied entirely to relationship status. A woman stops comparing her life constantly to societal expectations. She no longer sees herself as incomplete simply because she is alone. She stops rushing into connections out of fear, pressure, or emotional dependency. Instead, she begins making choices based on emotional alignment, peace, and authenticity. Society often struggles to understand women who are genuinely content outside traditional relationship structures because it challenges deeply rooted beliefs about success and fulfillment. People frequently assume that happiness without romantic attachment must be temporary, artificial, or incomplete. But many women discover that emotional stability, self-respect, freedom from chaos, and inner peace create a deeper form of happiness than constantly seeking validation through unstable relationships ever could. Real happiness begins quietly. It begins when a woman no longer abandons herself in order to keep others close. It begins when she stops measuring her worth by who chooses her and starts recognizing the value that already exists within her. It begins when she understands that love can enrich life beautifully, but her entire existence does not depend on whether someone stays or leaves, desires her or rejects her, understands her or misunderstands her.